You're not the victim. You're the storm you swore you survived. He touched your body, but you whispered to someone else. You played soft, but your silence screamed louder than his truth. You dressed your guilt in innocence and prayed no one noticed. The angel in you lies next to devils every night. You didn't break his heart. You watched it fall. You kissed him with lips that mourned another. You stayed because it hurt, just not enough to leave. You cried for the love you never truly gave. Your tears were real, but your loyalty wasn't. You weren't looking for love. You were escaping yourself. You let him heal you, then left him bleeding. You wanted peace, but fed the fire. You wanted forever, but played like it was temporary. You said you loved him, but only when it felt safe. You turned away when he was finally looking. You romanticized your pain to avoid changing. You said goodbye before he even said hello. You wanted truth, but couldn't handle your own. You kept him close so no one would see you break. You prayed for healing while picking at your wounds. You begged for honesty, then lied to yourself. You looked like love, but felt like confusion. You weren't loyal. You were lonely. You flirted with ghosts while he held your soul. You didn't want love. You wanted attention dressed in devotion. You hurt him like someone once hurt you. You found comfort in chaos and called it passion. You acted lost but mapped the entire path to his heart. You whispered love but screamed detachment. You were never confused. You were in control. You broke him so you'd never feel small again. You knew what he needed and gave him the opposite. You were the red flag hiding in white sheets. You pretended you couldn't see the pain. You designed it. You didn't leave because you were scared. You left because you were done pretending. You painted heartbreak as art, but it was just avoidance. You turned him into a memory before he became real. You weren't healing, you were hiding. You called him temporary to avoid your own permanence. You blamed timing, but it was always you. You needed love, not him. You used his soul like a diary and never read it twice. You wanted someone who wouldn't survive losing you. You looked faithful, but moved like temptation. You were the heartbreak you feared. You knew exactly how to stay and still feel gone. You dressed your ego in heartbreak and called it growth. You mistook his softness for weakness. You didn't break him accidentally. You shattered him beautifully. You waited until he was full of you, then left. You buried your guilt in his silence. You gave just enough to keep him hoping. You smiled while he unraveled. You made love feel like punishment. You wanted the version of him that didn't exist. You seduced him with the idea of safety. You played pure, but your eyes held history. You ghosted, then wondered why no one stayed. You held his heart like it was disposable. You stayed long enough to be missed, not loved. You prayed for love, but fed off destruction. You spoke of forever while planning your exit. You disappeared just when he started dreaming. You wanted to be chased, not cherished. You disguised manipulation as mystery. You saw the light in him and dimmed it. You left him craving what you never planned to give. You kissed like comfort, but loved like chaos. You made him prove himself, then vanished. You weren't unsure, you were unkind. You took his devotion and drained it for validation. You saw his softness and sharpened your edges. You watched him bleed and blamed his heartbeat. You weren't trying to heal, you wanted to haunt. You made him question love so you wouldn't have to. You called it fate, but you were always the architect. You didn't fall, you aimed. You were the prayer he thought was answered. You gave him just enough to miss you forever. You tasted love and spit it out like poison. You needed chaos to feel alive. You made him believe he was broken so you wouldn't feel guilty. You left a mark where there should have been a scar. You vanished to protect the lie you were living. You wrapped heartbreak in poetry and hoped he'd never read it. You were the silence after the storm, empty, not calm. You left when it started feeling real. You lied with grace and smiled through the wreckage. You said, "I'm healing," but kept reopening the wound. You needed someone to chase the shadow of who you used to be. You made him fall in love with a mask. You hated being alone, but feared being known. You didn't want love. You wanted proof you could still be wanted. You took his warmth and blamed him for the cold. You weren't pretending, you were performing. You loved the attention, not the man. You never meant to stay, you just wanted him to beg. You loved the way he loved you, not him. You weren't looking for a soulmate, you were looking for an audience. You asked for loyalty, then tested it cruelly. You ran before he could see the real you. You said, "I care," and called it closure. You forgave yourself too quickly for the damage you never admitted. You left pieces of yourself in people you never planned to stay for. You called him too much after draining everything from him. You touched him like love, then tore him like white war. You turned healing into performance art. You made him earn what you never valued. You broke him in ways applause can't fix. You promised peace, then brought your storm. You blamed the universe for choices you made with full awareness. You wanted attention to fill the void, not love to light it. You hated when he read you because he saw through you. You asked him to wait while you played elsewhere. You left mid-sentence and still expected him to write your ending. You called him home, but never gave him the key. You made him chase what you never planned to give. You weren't lost. You were avoiding being found. You broke what was beautiful just to prove you could. You let him drown in feelings you pretended to share. You stitched your name into his scars. You asked for purity while holding poison. You got bored when he finally felt safe. You lit the match, then cried about the fire. You called him intense because he didn't play pretend. You stayed long enough to ruin him, not love him. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a mirror. You let him think he was chosen. You spoke in riddles so you wouldn't have to admit the truth. You gave him just enough light to keep him walking in your dark. You played savior to distract from being the villain. You weren't scared of love. You were scared of being seen. You pulled away every time it started to feel honest. You haunted him while pretending you'd already left. You lied like it was poetry. You made your emptiness his responsibility. You glamorized suffering so no one would question your silence. You disappeared so you wouldn't have to explain yourself. You smiled while setting emotional traps. You didn't want him healed. You wanted him dependent. You blamed your past, but knew what you were doing. You weren't chasing love. You were fleeing guilt. You left before you could be held accountable. You craved devotion, but feared exposure. You whispered forever with one foot out the door. You wanted him to hurt quietly so you could stay comfortable. You called him obsessive after begging him to never let go. You found power in withholding, not love in giving. You painted pain with your fingerprints. You watched him unravel, then called it overreacting. You wanted revenge for wounds he never made. You disguised emotional control as care. You said, "I miss you," while holding someone else. You held his love like a hostage. You needed him to suffer so you wouldn't feel alone. You let him hope. That was the cruelest part. You knew you were his lesson and still played the part. You loved being wanted, not being known. You used his honesty to sharpen your exit. You left holes in him and called them boundaries. You called him fragile after breaking him. You asked for closure while reopening wounds. You made his vulnerability your playground. You dressed manipulation in intimacy. You ghosted him and still watched his stories. You threw him crumbs and blamed him for starving. You wanted to be worshipped, not understood. You lied to him gently so you could lie to yourself louder. You disappeared, but left your name where he bleeds. You made healing look like punishment. You hated how much he loved the real you. You never meant to stay, but hated when he let go. You needed his pain to validate your worth. You liked the way he broke. You said you were complicated just to excuse being cruel. You used your sadness as a shield and your silence as a sword. You punished him for loving you too loudly. You made him believe your chaos was divine. You hid cruelty in compliments. You needed him to want you more than he needed peace. You weren't a phase, you were a warning. You ruined him quietly and called it growth. You needed someone to blame for your self-abandonment. You cried over consequences, not guilt. You left love notes in someone else's hands. You built intimacy with no intention of staying. You said we when you meant me. You watched him heal just to test if he still bled for you. You loved the idea of him, not the truth of him. You left your mess in his soul and called him dramatic. You disappeared like nothing mattered, then stalked him like everything did. You said, I care, when you really meant, don't forget me. You made him feel chosen just to feel powerful. You hid your intentions behind emotional poetry. You weren't healing, you were collecting hearts. You loved being a lesson more than being loved. You mistook control for connection. You broke him into poetry so you wouldn't have to apologize. You offered comfort so he'd stay in your chaos. You left your fingerprints on his peace. You made him prove he mattered over and over again. You only said, I miss you, when no one else was calling.